The Bible is filled with riddles. Every detail in the text carries meanings in it. Some of those meanings are somewhat obvious to most people, but many of its meanings are hidden within the nuances and details among the arrangement of different words. I think the Lord must have intended it like this. There's supposed to be hardships and difficulties if we really want to follow Him, and that also extends to trying to wrestle over the meaning of Scriptures, which are not always so perfectly clear to us. Like most people, I also frequently run into verses or scriptural passages that leave me wondering what the meaning of the text is. In this video, I want to share one particular riddle in the text that I have a hard time explaining within my own fallible understanding of church teaching. I have a theory that might explain it, which I'll introduce here, but I'm not very confident about this theory. The verses in question are these ones from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. 1 Corinthians 6 verses 15 to 16, do you not know that your bodies are a part of Christ? So then, should I take a part of Christ and make it a part of a harlot? Let not be so. And do you not know that whoever is joined to a harlot becomes one body? For the two, he said, shall be as one flesh. What is Paul saying here? Obviously, we are not supposed to be having intercourse with prostitutes, but Paul is saying more than just that. He is saying that when a Christian lies with a harlot, a part of Christ is thus becoming a part of a harlot. He is saying that when the Christian lies with the harlot, the two of them are joined together into one body, one flesh. For anyone who has studied church teaching and biblical verses about marriage, this phrase should be very familiar, because Christ uses exactly the same phrase to explain why men cannot divorce their wives. Mark 10 verses 7 to 12, because of this, a man shall leave behind his father and mother, and he shall cling to his wife. And these two shall be one in flesh. And so they are now not two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no man separate. And again, in the house, his disciples questioned him about the same thing. And he said to them, whoever dismisses his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if a wife dismisses her husband and is married to another, she commits adultery. What is the meaning of this? Is Paul really saying that when a man has intercourse with a prostitute, that they become one flesh in the way that a husband and wife are one flesh? Is he really saying that the two become married through this act and, thus a part of Christ, then becomes one flesh with a prostitute? I read this, and that seems to be what Paul is saying, but my problem is that that doesn't really fit with how I understand church teaching about marriage. Let me explain my fallible understanding of what the church teaches about this. The church teaches that marriage was instituted by God when Adam and Eve were created, and it has existed since the beginning of humanity, long before Christ came. When a man and a woman get married, they are joined together in a union that can no longer be dissolved by anything except the death of one of them. Governments cannot dissolve this bond. The parties themselves don't have the power to dissolve this bond. Even the church itself lacks the power to dissolve this bond. If one party cheats, the bond remains intact. If one party is violent or abusive, the bond remains intact. If one of them loses their sexual organs through disease or injury, the bond remains intact. If one of them loses their sanity, goes into a coma, or suffers permanent brain damage and goes into a vegetative state, as long as they are both still living, the bond still remains intact. This is why divorce and remarriage are not permissible, since if this bond is truly formed and the two of them have become one flesh, then even if they get a civil divorce that is recognized in the law and they go and marry someone else, the second marriage can never be a valid marriage, since as long as the first marriage existed, then it will continue to exist no matter what, until one of the two members of the marriage dies. In order to support this strict observance of the indissolubility of marriage, the church cites what Christ says in the gospel, such as what I have here, and repeats what Christ said, that since they're now one flesh through their bond, they can no longer be separated. The church also has something called the sacrament of marriage, which is a sacrament that the church gives to Catholic marriages within the church in order to infuse them with God's grace. But the sacrament of marriage is not actually the same thing as marriage in the universal sense. Marriage has existed since Adam and Eve, and it is real both within the church and outside of the church. But the sacrament of marriage is something instituted by Christ, and it is only used for marriages within the church. All marriages within the church are always sacramental. A marriage does not need to be sacramental in order for it to be a true marriage. When people are married outside the church, the marriage is a true marriage, but it is not sacramental. Marriages outside the church lack the grace that the sacrament of marriage bestows on a marriage, but they are still valid marriages. To put it simply, sacramental marriages inside the church and non-sacramental marriages outside the church are both valid marriages in the eyes of God. In either case, an indissoluble bond is formed that cannot be broken by any human authority. Now, the church also says that there are such things as impediments to valid marriages. I'll go into this in more detail later. But for example, if two people were close relatives, or if their consent was coerced rather than freely given, then the church will say that such a marriage was invalid. And whether it was in the church or outside the church, no marriage bond is formed in such circumstances. In God's eyes, the two people are not married because of an impediment that existed that prevented them from being truly married. When the church believes an impediment exists in a Catholic marriage, the church can make a formal declaration called an annulment, where it essentially declares that a valid marriage does not exist between two people who received the sacrament of marriage previously. And when the church makes such a declaration, the two people are then free to marry again, since their previous marriage never existed to begin with. To be clear, an annulment is not a divorce, even though it is sometimes thought of as like a Catholic divorce. An annulment is a statement that no valid marriage existed because of an impediment that exists to the marriage. But the church teaches that if a marriage is indeed valid, then there is no human authority that possesses the power to break it. Now, there's another aspect of Catholic marriage that can be very confusing to people, and even clergy sometimes make errors about this. The difficult thing to understand is that marriage in canon law and marriage in divine law are not necessarily the same thing. Canon law only recognizes sacramental Catholic marriages. Either you were married in the church within a sacramental marriage, or you or your spouse became Catholic as an adult after you got married, and your marriage bond then became a sacramental marriage at the time of you or your spouse's entrance into the church. Otherwise, your marriage is not a Catholic marriage. From the perspective of canon law, all marriages outside the church are not recognized, regardless of whether or not they were valid marriages. If you married after baptism outside the Catholic Church, or you married and divorced outside the church before becoming Catholic, then these other marriages are not recognized by canon law. But in divine law, these may be actual legitimate marriages. A man can divorce and remarry a dozen times before baptism, but only the wife that he has at the time he is baptized will be recognized as his actual wife in canon law, even if in God's eyes, that woman is not his actual wife. But he does not need to fear that God will judge him for staying with this woman who is not his actual wife. Because if the church blesses the marriage canonically, then he can rest his conscience about it as well. What the church considers to be a canonically valid marriage and what God considers to be a true marriage are not always the same thing. And this is not a mistake, although it is common for people in the church to fail to grasp this and assume that they are the same thing. This isn't some new innovation either, but it goes back to the time of the apostles, and it is in the New Testament. 1 Corinthians 7 verses 10 to 16. To the married, however, I give this instruction, not I, but the Lord. A wife should not separate from her husband, and if she does separate, she must either remain single or become reconciled to her husband, and a husband should not divorce his wife. To the rest I say, not the Lord. If any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she is willing to go on living with him, he should not divorce her. And if any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he is willing to go on living with her, she should not divorce her husband. For the unbelieving husband is made holy through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy through the brother. Otherwise your children would be unclean, whereas in fact they are holy. If the unbeliever separates, however, let him separate. The brother or sister is not bound in such cases. God has called you to peace. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife. This is what church tradition has called the Pauline privilege. Since ancient times, and even down to today, the church follows the practice that if someone becomes baptized and their spouse decides to leave them on account of their faith, then the church will count their previous marriage as though it were annulled, and the person is then free to marry a second time in the church. But take note of what Paul says here. Even Paul says that this is his own judgment as an apostle, and that it comes from him and not from Christ. Christ never said that you can remarry if your spouse rejects you on account of your faith. From this you can see that even in the church of the apostles, they knew that if marriages were recognized by the church, then that didn't itself mean that the marriages were recognized by God. The bonding of two people in one flesh occurred before Christ came into the world. His coming into the world didn't cause these marriages to stop being marriages on account of one of the spouses believing and the other then separating from their spouse. Paul is telling people here that they are free to remarry, even if that spouse who left them was their true spouse in the eyes of God. From the very beginning of the church, there has thus always been a difference between marriage in canon law and marriage in divine law. This easily confuses people, including even some clergy. How is it possible that the church would recognize marriages that are not actually valid marriages in God's eyes, or that would refuse to recognize marriages that are indeed valid marriages in God's eyes? Why would Paul tell people to follow his teaching when he knew that this wasn't actually what Christ was speaking? This is my attempt to explain it. Let us suppose that the church chose to recognize marriages that occurred outside of the church. What would that then mean? Suppose an adult came to be baptized in the church, but they had been divorced and remarried in a non-sacramental marriage in the secular world prior to receiving baptism. But since canon law now is recognizing non-sacramental marriages as true marriages, he would then be bound to put away his current wife, since his former wife was then recognized as his one and only true spouse. This would be a major impediment that would probably stop many people from being baptized in such circumstances. But what if the man getting baptized were to then insist that he thought that his first marriage was not a valid marriage in church teaching? Maybe he could claim an impediment existed, like his wife maybe had some other partner before him, or they didn't understand that marriage was supposed to be lifelong when they got married. Then you would then need the church to go through an annulment court and investigation to try to figure out whether this man, who got married multiple times before baptism, was or was not in fact married to some person in his previous life. It would create a huge impediment for someone getting baptized on the basis of what was just a possibility. And this possibility could perhaps need years to figure out, and maybe even if you investigated, you would never find ample evidence that could prove the case either way. It would perhaps create a huge mess that would weigh on the consciences of people as they tried to figure out whether marriages were valid or not when they occurred outside the church. The church's mission is to bring people to salvation, and when the church then uses canon law to make a definitive statement about when marriages will be recognized or not, it is then using its authority to tell people that they do not need to burn their consciences on these questions that they may never be able to answer. Your marriage may be valid or invalid in God's eyes, but as long as you follow what the church has set down canonically, then that is enough. Your conscience can be at peace because you don't need to do more than that. Perhaps that compromise puts a little thorn into the body of Christ, because we then have unions recognized in the church that are not recognized by God. But as Paul said about the thorn that God had given to him, God's grace is sufficient. We don't need more than that. If you obey the church's canon law about marriage, even if your marriage is not recognized by God, then you can still confidently hope that you remain in God's grace, and that is all you need. In other words, in the final analysis, you don't need to be right in order to be saved, but you just need to be seeking what is right in order to be saved. But a problematic consequence that comes out of this system is that it confuses people in the church who may assume that marriage in divine law is identical with marriage in church law. Theologically, they are not the same. In order for a marriage to be recognized by the church, other than the fact that it must be a sacramental marriage in the church, several other elements are needed. Firstly, there needs to be the free and rational consent of the two parties. Forced marriages are not valid marriages. And similarly, if the two parties lack reason, like if one of them was drunk or they lack the use of reason, then the marriage is not valid. They must freely agree and be aware of what it is that they are entering into. Apart from this, there are 12 impediments in canon law, and if one of these impediments is present, then the marriage is not recognized by the church. These 12 impediments are: 1. If the male is less than 16 or the female is under 14. 2. Permanent impotence, being defined as the inability to have intercourse, which existed prior to the marriage being contracted. 3. If a prior marriage existed. 4. If one of the parties of the marriage was not a Catholic. 5. If the male is a member of the clergy. 6. If one of the two people in the marriage had previously made a vow of chastity in a religious order. 7. If the woman was abducted or forced against her will. 8. If someone entering the marriage had killed or assisted in killing a former spouse in order to enter this marriage. 9. If the parties are closely related to each other by blood. 10. If the parties are the ancestors or descendants of their in-laws. 11. If the parties are the parents or children of people whom they had previously been cohabiting in a sexual relationship with. 12. Those who are related to each other through adoption. If one of these impediments exists, then the marriage cannot be contracted in the church. If one of these impediments is discovered after the marriage has been established, then there is then grounds to ask for an annulment to the marriage. Most of these impediments can be dispensed by church authorities. Either the bishop or the pope has the authority to dismiss most of these impediments and give people special permission to get married in spite of the impediment. For example, in practice, impediment number 4 in the list above is rarely used to prevent people from getting married today, since most dioceses will generally give permission for Catholics to marry non-Catholics. In church history, Henry VIII famously was given a dispensation by the Pope to marry his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon. But when she couldn't give him a son, he argued that the Pope's dispensation was invalid, therefore he should be allowed to marry again. But several of these impediments cannot be dispensed by any church authority, including the Pope. Impediment 2, Impediment 3, and Impediment 9 cannot be removed by any authority, because these are traditionally understood as deriving from divine law and not only from church law. Furthermore, the consent to marry in the first place is also traditionally considered as something that is necessary for marriage on the basis of divine law and not simply church law. Canon law also has a list of things that are necessary in order for consent to be considered as existing. Here is a list of the things that are considered to invalidate marital consent within canon law. 1. Those who cannot rationally enter the marriage because of mental illness, lack of sufficient use of reason, or a grave defect of judgment concerning the essential matrimonial rights. 2. Those who are unaware that marriage is a permanent partnership between a man and a woman who produce children through a sexual union. 3. Those who married the wrong person as a result of mistaken identity. Think of Laban tricking Jacob to lie with Leah rather than Rachel. 4. Those who were tricked into marriage by malicious deception regarding some quality of the other person that would have gravely disturbed their conjugal life. 5. Those who married someone with an error in judgment about the indissolubility, unity, or sacramental nature of a marriage, and who would not have entered the marriage had they not been living under this error. 6. If one of the two parties by some positive action have shown that they did not consent to something that marriages need to have. 7. A marriage that is subject to a condition about the future. 8. A marriage that is subject to a condition about the past or present, when that condition is false. 9. A marriage that is subject to a condition about the past or present, which was not approved by the local bishop. 10. A marriage that is entered into as a result of force or grave fear. 11. The parties were not present together to express their consent to getting married, either in person or by proxy. 12. Marriages that use a proxy to express their consent, but the proxy does not fulfill the church's specific requirements concerning proxies. Marital consent is something that the divine law requires for marriage to have, and not just church law. But in the list above, there are things that belong to divine law and things that belong to church law only. For example, divine law says nothing about whether a local bishop needs to approve a condition about the past or present in order for it to be used to enter a marriage. Returning to my riddle about 1 Corinthians, I want to ask the question now if number 2 in this list above is from divine law or from church law only. In other words, if two people enter a marriage when they don't believe it is a permanent union for creating children, is that marriage invalid only in church law, or does God also not consider it to be marriage either? The church magisterium has spoken about marriage over the centuries, but I haven't succeeded in locating a clear reference that answers this specific question I am posing here. The Catechism deals with marriage as a sacrament in the church, as well as morality concerning marriage and sexuality in the Sixth Commandment, but it doesn't seem to answer the specific question about whether this quality in point 2 makes or nullifies a marriage within divine law, apart from church law. The closest I seem to have found is this quotation from Pius XI in his 1930 encyclical Casti Connubii. 6. Yet although matrimony is of its very nature of divine institution, the human will, too, enters into it and performs a most noble part. For each individual marriage, inasmuch as it is a conjugal union of a particular man and woman, arises only from the free consent of each of the spouses, and this free act of the will, by which each party hands over and accepts those rights proper to the state of marriage. Pius XI says that the free consent is a free act of will, wherein each party hands over and accepts the rights that are proper to the state of marriage. The next question is then, what are these rights that are proper to the state of marriage? The encyclical then has a footnote here, and the footnote is a reference to Canon 1081, Part 2 in the old 1917 Code of Canon Law. Here is the translated text of that canon. Matrimonial consent is an act of the will by which each party gives and accepts perpetual and exclusive rights to the body for those actions that are of themselves suitable for the generation of children. We can infer from the footnote that Pope Pius XI was probably referring to the things mentioned in this canon when he said that marital consent means to consent to the rights proper to the marriage. But I have a problem with this, because footnote references to external documents don't normally cause the contents of those documents to possess magisterial authority, even if they are being referenced in magisterial documents. Modern magisterial documents even sometimes quote secular documents and not just church documents. Hence, while I think it is a reasonable interpretation to say that this canon was what the Pope was teaching to be meant by the rights proper to marriage, the fact that he doesn't say this explicitly in the encyclical itself is problematic, because that interpretation can also be challenged. For example, someone could claim that he only meant that some part of what that canon said was part of the consent in divine law and not necessarily the whole canon. I haven't found a clearer reference than this, however, and as a result, I think I can't say for certain whether the church magisterium has ever actually said that a person needs to consent to a permanent, exclusive union that is open to children in order for a marriage to be valid within divine law and not just church law. Because of this, I think it is possible to question whether this is actually a necessary condition for marriage in divine law. And now I'm going to try to make the case for why I think it may not be something that the divine law requires in order for a marriage to be valid. First, think about the gospel. Jesus said in the gospel that if you divorce your wife and marry another, then you commit adultery, and that if you marry a divorced woman, then you commit adultery. Now, think about the context in which Jesus said these words. Moses had told the Israelites that they could divorce their spouses and remarry. The Jews believed that God had permitted them to divorce and marry again. In other words, Christ's audience was a society of people who didn't believe that marriage was necessarily a permanent union. If you need to believe that marriage is a permanent union that cannot be ended at will, otherwise your marriage is not valid, then probably most of the marriages of the Jews would have been invalid marriages by that fact. And if that is true, then why did Christ tell them this? Why didn't he rather tell them that they were all living in adultery, since none of their marriages were valid marriages? But instead, he says that they commit adultery not by staying with their current wives, but rather if they left their current wives and married another woman. And he says that if you marry a divorced woman, then you commit adultery. That wouldn't make any sense if these marriages were invalid, because if they were invalid, then the divorced woman was free to remarry by that very fact. The Jews took offense at Christ when he told them that they were forbidden from remarrying or that they were committing adultery when they married divorced women. But if the way that current canon law explains it is the same as divine law, then Christ's actions make little sense. Because why would he tell them that they were committing adultery by remarrying rather than telling them that they were committing adultery by continuing to live in their current invalid unions? The second thing I want to use to make the case that this part of canon law is not actually part of divine law is using canon law itself. Look back at the list of the things that canon law lists as being necessary for marital consent to be considered valid under canon law. What Canon 1096 says and what Canon 1099 says are seemingly in contradiction with each other. Canon 1096 tells us that the two parties must know that marriage is a permanent, exclusive union that is meant for the procreation of children through sexual acts. If they don't know this, then the marriage is invalid. Canon 1099, however, tells us that if there is error about the indissolubility, unity, or sacramental nature of marriage in the church, then this error does not invalidate the marriage, unless the error is also determining the will to enter the marriage. Canon 1096 says that if the two parties don't know that it is a permanent union, then the marriage is invalid. Canon 1099 says that if the two parties are in error about the indissolubility of the union, then this does not invalidate the marriage, unless that error determined the will to get married. How should we explain this seeming contradiction? Catholic doctrine cannot contain internal contradictions. But canon law is not a doctrinal document. It is a legal document. A law code can contain seeming contradictions when we recognize that law codes only have effect insofar as the question of how they are enforced. I would guess that the logic of this is therefore related to the enforcement. Canon 1096 is meant to be enforced when the couple approaches the priest to ask for marriage. But Canon 1099 is meant to be enforced during the time period after they have already been married. In other words, when a man and a woman approach a priest and ask to get married in the church, if the two do not believe that their marriage is supposed to be permanent and exclusive only to each other, then the priest should tell them that he cannot marry them in the church. This is what Canon 1096 is requiring. But suppose that the couple got married anyways in the church, despite those errors, and then 10 years later, they discover that marriage in the church is supposed to be permanent. But this changes nothing for them because they still intend to remain together. Their marriage the previous 10 years doesn't become invalid because they had an error about the indissolubility of marriage. They don't need to go back to the priest again and ask him to marry them again because their error didn't change anything about their will to be married to each other. This is what Canon 1099 is stating. But if Canon 1096 was a hard requirement based in divine law, then actually they do need to be married again, since the previous 10 years was an adulterous union on account of the fact that they misunderstood the moral teaching about the indissolubility of marriage. I think some dioceses misunderstand this as well, because some annulment courts may say that if the couple lacked understanding about one of these core aspects of the marriage, then they will declare that the marriage never existed to begin with. But I think that that's effectively ignoring what Canon 1099 is saying. Marriages that have already occurred should not be considered as invalid on account of the fact that the couple has an error about those things mentioned in 1096. Only if the error would have changed the question of whether they entered the marriage in the first place. For example, suppose in a polygamous society, a man is baptized as a Catholic and then he marries in the church. But he wrongly thought that he would be allowed to marry again after taking his first wife. And when he is told by the church that he cannot marry a second time after this, if he says upon discovering the error that had he known this, then he would have never married his first wife, then according to Canon 1099, the marriage should then be considered invalid, since the error determined the will. But if he learns this, and then says that he would still have married this woman, even had he known that he couldn't marry a second time, then the marriage should be considered valid and cannot be annulled, since the error did not determine his will. Or to give another example, suppose in a society that generally accepted divorce, a woman marries a man, but as a result of conflict, she decides to leave him and find another husband. But after she finds another man who will marry her, she discovers that divorce and remarriage is not permitted in the church. If she says that she would have never married the first husband had she have known this, then the marriage can be annulled because the error determined her will. But if, on the other hand, suppose she said in all honesty that even had she known this, she would have still likely married this man, hoping that things would turn out for the best for them, even though she now regretted having married him on account of conflict between them that started after the marriage. In that case, according to my reading of Canon 1099, this marriage cannot be annulled because the will to enter the union in the first place was not being determined by the error. Here is the crux of this argument, though. If Canon 1096 was a hard requirement that came from divine law, then Canon 1099 makes no sense. If it was divine law, then every marriage of people in error should be considered invalid. If believing that divorce or having multiple partners is legitimate means that the marriage is then not existing, then everyone who believes in one of these errors needs to be married in the church a second time, if they discover that they have these errors. But Canon 1099 is anticipating exactly that problem, and it is saying that the marriage is only invalid if the error would have changed the initial decision by the parties to enter the marriage. Perhaps I am wrong, but in my reading and reasoning about canon law, I think that is the correct interpretation we should make of this. The fundamental point that comes out of this, though, is that Canon 1096 cannot be something based in divine law. If it was, then Canon 1099 is seemingly violating divine law when it says that such unions can still be considered as valid marriages. Hence, I argue that divine law does not have this requirement for marriages to be valid. Jesus told the Jews that they committed adultery when they married a divorced woman because he recognized their marriages as valid, despite the fact that they believed in divorce. The requirement that the couple needs to believe that marriage is indissoluble and exclusive to each other is something that the church has set down in its own rules. It is a sensible rule to have, since marriage is indeed indissoluble and exclusive to the spouses. The church should not be permitting marriage between people who don't believe this. But it is only church law that says that people need to believe this in order for people to get married. Divine law does not actually require it. If people do not believe these things, then their marriages may still be valid in divine law. Now, if I am right in my argument about this, and God recognizes marriages as valid regardless of whether the people believe the union was indissoluble or not, regardless of whether the people believe that they were supposed to be exclusively faithful to their spouse or not, regardless of whether they plan to have children or not, then I think that this might answer my initial riddle about how are we supposed to look at that verse in 1 Corinthians. Even if you don't have the will to enter a permanent relationship, the marriage is still valid in divine law, even if you could not get legitimately married in the church like this. Now, then suppose you had a man and woman who got married, but they only planned to remain married for 5 years. In canon law, the marriage is invalid, but in divine law, it may be valid, as long as no other impediments exist. If the will to enter a permanent relationship is not actually a requirement in divine law, then this is the logical conclusion you have to make from this. As long as their decision to enter the union for those 5 years was not going to change as a result of someone informing them that marriage was supposed to be permanent, then the marriage is still valid in divine law. If the couple said that they would have never entered this 5-year union had they known about the requirement, then the marriage was invalid. But as long as they still had the will to enter the union regardless of what they knew about the permanence of marriage, then in divine law, the marriage is still valid. Now, suppose the couple was not planning to get married for only 5 years, but what if it was only planning to be married for 1 year? Or what about being married for only 1 month, 1 week, 1 night? If the will to remain in a permanent union is not actually a requirement in divine law, then even if the couple only planned to be married for a single evening, then their marriage is still valid in divine law, as long as no other impediments exist. If you can see the logic in this reasoning, then I think therein lies the answer to how we are supposed to understand what Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians. When Paul said that you become one flesh with a prostitute, he perhaps meant exactly that. If no other impediment exists, then when a man and a prostitute engage in intercourse, they become married in divine law, and the two become one flesh. And thus, a part of the body of Christ then becomes one flesh with a prostitute. And as she continues to serve client after client, Spiritually, there's a piece of the body of Christ that is connected together with her as she carries out this evil in her body. In church law, this marriage would never be recognized as a true marriage. But if I am right in my thinking in divine law, the marriage has taken place and the two are now one flesh. Think about this question. If you don't need to understand that marriage is indissoluble, exclusive, and meant to bear children, in order to be married in divine law, so long as failing to understand those things doesn't decide your consent, then what exactly are you consenting to when you consent to be married? If it is not consent to these things, then what things is it consent to? Consent is necessary for marriage in divine law. We know this because the church magisterium has told us this. But if the person doesn't need to believe these things about the union in order for the union to actually take place, then obviously the consent that divine law requires is not actually about these things. I'm going to suggest that for divine law, the only thing that is required is mutual consent to engage in normal intercourse. If they consent to have intercourse and no other impediment exists, and they would not have changed that consent as a result of knowing that intercourse was only supposed to happen in a permanent exclusive union that is open to children, then they become married once the one act is carried out. The two become one flesh, even if it is just for one evening, as long as the two have not been married before, are not close relatives, and are capable of normal intercourse, and would not have changed their decision to engage in intercourse as a result of knowing that intercourse was only supposed to happen in a permanent exclusive union that is open to children, then they become married in that moment, even if they never see each other again. If I am right, it would mean that there are a lot of people in this world who are actually married to people other than their spouses, especially in our modern era after the sexual revolution. Two high school sweethearts who have intercourse with each other become one flesh through choosing that act. And even if they break up before graduation and never see each other again, they're still husband and wife in God's eyes, and whoever they marry in the future is not actually their real husband or wife. Paul's words about the prostitute would not be true about every client that the prostitute has, but only for the first client who she had intercourse with, wherein the two of them had no other impediments that stopped them from being married. She would then become one flesh with that client, and any subsequent clients would be having intercourse with a woman who already was one body with another man. And as Paul warned, a piece of the holy body of Christ was then joined into one flesh with a body engaging in prostitution. In the modern world, we should also remember that many prostitutes are not really consenting to intercourse because of human trafficking and the fact that they are coerced into providing services, and that would serve as an impediment that nullifies consent as well. Many Catholics today know what the Church teaches about marriage, but that doesn't stop them from consenting to engage in intercourse before getting married. If I am right, then in divine law, they become married through that consent to intercourse, even though they haven't consented to a lifelong commitment. Since their consent to engage in the intercourse wasn't changed as a result of knowing what the Church taught, then the existence of the consent then binds the two together into one flesh in God's sight. You don't need to plan on having a lifelong commitment in order for the marriage to exist. That is perhaps a misunderstanding. The consent is not about consenting to a permanent length of time. Christ treated the Jewish marriages as valid, even though they hadn't consented to an indissoluble union. In divine law, consent to a lifelong commitment is not a necessary factor to establish the consent that makes the marriage. In church law, it is necessary, but marriage in canon law is not the same as marriage in divine law. Even if this theory of mine is true, it wouldn't really change anything about the practice of the Church. The Church has never claimed that the marriages recognized in the Church are the same as the marriages recognized by God. As I mentioned earlier, there are instances where it can be quite obvious that the Church is not recognizing a true marriage. If two Protestants marry each other in what they believe to be a lifelong commitment open to children, and they spend 40 years together, but then one of them decides to divorce and marry someone else, and then afterwards he decides to join the Catholic Church, the Catholic Church will only recognize the second spouse as the real spouse, because that is what canon law dictates. God, however, may not recognize the second spouse. But as Catholics, we only need to worry about what canon law says concerning marriage. Although this system perhaps allows for little thorns to get into the body of Christ, as Paul wrote about his own thorn, God's grace is sufficient. As long as we are in marriages recognized by the church, we do not need to worry about the question as to whether they are recognized by God. God will not blame us for following what his church tells us, even if it is different from his plan. Even if we are wrong, we need not worry, because his grace is sufficient. In conclusion, I am not sure if this theory is true, and I caution anyone about accepting it. For me, this seems like the most logical way to explain this riddle in Corinthians, and what is actually needed for marriage and divine law apart from canon law. But if it does in fact contradict what the church teaches, then it can't be true. I suggest it only as a possibility under the belief that it doesn't contradict what the church has taught. And of course, if you think you have a better way to explain this riddle in Corinthians, please share it in the comments below.